Hello, welcome to Week 3, Philosophies of Life. This lecture and the other instructional materials for Unit 1, both Weeks 2 and 3, are paired with Philosophy Toolkit 1. Please continue to take notes on the important concepts, distinctions, and debatable theses from that handout as you review the materials for this unit. Week 2, last week, introduced you to the idea of philosophy as a way of life, and in particular to Socrates, who, though he himself wrote nothing, is considered to be a founder of Western philosophy. We followed Socrates around, living a philosophical life, questioning and examining his fellow Athenians, and then being put on trial for doing so. We also met the 20th century German philosopher Martin Heidegger and the 21st century American philosopher Hubert Dreyfus, who also present philosophy as a way of life on their understanding philosophy as a way of being authentically in the world, or of being fully human in the world. This week, we are going to do a deeper look at what it means to live a philosophical way of life, or to live an examined life. In particular, we're going to be focusing on the Socratic method, which is named after, you guessed it, Socrates, and its current relevance and application in our own technologically advanced modern world. Socrates is famous in particular for the Socratic method, which is considered even to this day to be a very valuable skill or tool in many professions, for example, organizational leadership, business management, counseling, conflict mediation, law, education, healthcare. All of those fields and others use Socratic method in various ways. In this week, we're going to focus on the specifics of Socratic method as a way of living the examined life, and we'll think about its application to contemporary issues. So, as you saw from both the podcast about Socrates and Plato's Apology, a big part of what Socratic method is just asking questions, asking people to get clear about what it is that they are saying and what it is that they're claiming. So Socrates usually, let me start over. Socratic method is a method of dialogue, a method of going back and forth like you saw Socrates doing, asking questions, responding to questions, with the goal of getting clear about what it is that people believe and untangling confusion in thoughts and ideas. So, of course, the first types of questions that Socrates asks are ones that ask his interlocutors, his fellow dialogue partners, to clarify specifically what they mean. And so he focuses largely on definitions of key terms, especially value terms, terms that have to do not with objective facts, but with the way that we value life, and ethical terms or terms about the human good. In particular, this term flourishing, or really the Greek term eudaimonia, which means a good spirit or a blessed spirit or a blessed life, sometimes translated as happiness or sometimes translated as flourishing. These are terms which Socrates is going to ask his interlocutors to define. And dictionary definitions are not going to be good enough. They're too broad, they're too general, they're too vague to really get clear on what do we mean by happiness. For example, think about what happiness means in the world state in the novel we're reading. Basically, how they define happiness there would be something like instant gratification, always getting what you want, never wanting what you can't have, or maybe physical pleasure and comfort and the absence of pain. Now, this is certainly not how Socrates would define flourishing or eudaimonia, which is going to have to do with virtue and care for the soul and the excellence, being an excellent human being. And so when we talk about the human good, and we all agree, the human good is happiness or flourishing. Well, what do we mean by that? How do we define flourishing? How do we define happiness? Is happiness just a temporary state of joy, or is happiness something bigger, something more that describes a whole life, a whole well-lived life. What do we mean by happiness? What do you mean by that? And you'll see that's why in our debate discussions, we're focused a lot on definitions, because this is actually how we're defining terms is actually a lot of what causes the disagreement. We're not defining our terms in the same way. And this is what Socrates noticed, and this is part of what he does, is try to get people to get clear about what they mean by that. Define your terms. Another way of getting people clear on what they mean is by making clear distinctions. Distinctions between things that are similar but still different. So for example, we might distinguish between what's moral and what's legal. And we might say, well, yes, it's legal to lie to your friends. There's nothing illegal about that. You're not getting charged, but it's not moral. It's not ethically right. Another important distinction for this class especially is the distinction between something that's instrumentally valuable and intrinsically valuable. Something that's instrumentally valuable is valuable for the sake of some other good that we desire or want to have. So money is the prime example of something that's instrumentally valuable. We only value money because of what we get from money, whether that's stuff, comfort. Maybe some people think money leads to happiness. There's a little truth there to that, and also a little falsehood. But we value money for the sake of what we can get from it. That's totally different from things that we value intrinsically, meaning we value them for their own sake just because they are good. So happiness tends to be one of these things that is a paradigm of an intrinsic value. If I say to you, well, why do you want to be happy? You're just going to look at me like, huh? I don't understand the question, which is right, because the answer is it's just happiness is just something that is good. We value it intrinsically for its own sake and not because it leads to other things. Now, it might also be instrumentally valued and lead to other goods like, physical health, but we would still value happiness in and of itself, even if it didn't lead to any other values, which is why we say that it is intrinsically valuable. It's important to distinguish instrumental versus intrinsic values because the instrumental values are our means, the way or the material that we achieve, that we use to achieve our ends, or goals. Our final ends, our ultimate goals, will be things that we think are intrinsically valuable, whether that's faith or love or flourishing, right? Those are the sort of ends of a human life, the goals, the things that we aim at. And the means are the things that are instrumentally valuable as a way of achieving those ends. So these are two important distinctions I'll be asking you to apply in your journals and in the debates going forward, to distinguish between things that are good intrinsically for their own sake versus things that are good instrumentally, that is, as a means to some further end. The next thing that Socrates and the Socratic method goes about checking in its questioning and examining is, are your beliefs consistent? Is your view consistent with itself? Or does your own view contradict itself? We also want to know, is your view consistent with other things that reasonable people know to be true or have good reasons to believe to be true? Is your view consistent with other known truths or accepted beliefs? So let me give you an example. I'm going to ask you this question. So I can imagine Socrates asking this question. He could to a contemporary person. He'd say, do you need to have a brain to think? Do you need to have a brain to think? Okay. If you answer yes to that question, now let me ask you another question. Do you believe you have a soul that survives past your body, that lives on after your death, that goes on to an afterlife? Okay. Now, if you've answered yes, you need a brain to think, and yes, you have a soul that survives the death of your body, the next question I imagine Socrates asking is, well, does that soul think after the death of your body when your brain is in the ground rotting? Now, see, if you answer yes to all three of these questions, yes, you need a brain to think. Yes, you have a soul that leaves your body, leaves your brain behind, and goes on to live in an afterlife. And yes, that soul thinks. Well, you have a contradiction. Those views are not internally consistent with one another. They can't all be true at the same time. And so that's one thing that Socratic method tries to do. Once we've gotten clear about what our definitions are and what it is that we believe, well, are our beliefs consistent with other beliefs that we hold or with other things in the world that we know or have good reason to accept to be true? So Socrates' goal in testing and examining his counterparts is to make sure that they are really seeking after things that are intrinsically valuable. And how he does that is asking them to define flourishing, happiness, eudaimonia, to seek out internal and external consistencies in order that they can know or have a true view, or at least a logically coherent view, on what the human good or a well-lived life really is. So for Socrates, this method was meant to help people seek out and know the human good so that they could live well, so that they could, again, be in the company of wisdom. But in our own world and day, people use this all the time for many different reasons, including the ones that Socrates had, this method. So we will again read Plato's Apology. I ask that you really do read it a second time. It's going to make more sense if you go through it a second time. And this time, what I want you to pay attention to is his use of the method. What kinds of questions does he ask? How does he show people when their views are logically inconsistent? So as you're reading this week's sources and you're taking your source notes, take notes on what does it mean? What is Socratic method? What is Socrates doing specifically? What kinds of questions is he asking? By the way, when you're taking your source notes, I always strongly recommend that you read the journal and debate instructions for that week first, and you take your notes geared towards those assignments, so that when you get to those assignments, your notes have already been building up towards those assignments. So after you reread Plato's Apology and looking for his method of asking questions, the next thing that you're going to do is watch this movie called The Examined Life, which is a contemporary interpretation of Socratic method. You see various philosophers walking around busy streets, having a dialogue, answering questions, but the dialogue that they're having, the questions that they're answering, the things that they're defining and digging into have to do with issues in contemporary modern human life. So we kind of see the modern twist on the Socratic way of living a philosophical life or seeking wisdom. We will continue to read Brave New World, which we can maybe think about it as the way of what happens when the possibility of living an examined life is totally taken away from us. We'll also be introduced in this week's chapters to a different civilization that's outside of the world state and be able to compare their different levels of technological advancement to their human well-being and flourishing. I hope you enjoy this week's sources. If you are having trouble with Plato's Apology, especially because I know it's a more difficult reading, don't hesitate to reach out, ask questions. I'm always happy to help.